Hi, I'm Tiffany Jana, and I'm the co-author of Erasing Institutional Bias.
And I'm Ashley Diaz Mejias, and I am the other co-author of Erasing Institutional Bias.
So we wrote this book to serve the people and create opportunities for you all to learn about institutional bias and take some action where you see inequities. The book actually features a number of very specific biases. We didn't want to be overly general because we find that it's easier to help yourself and instigate change if you know what you're looking at. So we addressed occupational bias, gender bias, racial bias, hiring and advancement bias, customer bias, and retribution bias, which we're particularly proud of, I would say. We wrote this book because we are both very passionate about the challenges around equity and social justice, and we recognize that with all the conversation that's happening right now about unconscious bias, it's not just the individual work that has to happen. Unconscious bias and sometimes overt bias shows up in the workplace and shows up in institutions, and we wanted to offer some practical solutions for how we as individuals and maybe as leaders and organizations can intervene when we see bias at play.
It's important to look at the research and look at the studies and the analysis that's being done, but also look at it with an eye towards moving forward, both as an individual and as a person who is aware of her or his place in institutions and in systems. So as we laid out these steps that we do in the book, it was really with an eye towards that and towards helping folks both be aware of what research is out there and also of what they can do within systems and institutions. Institutional bias shows up in our daily lives in a lot of different ways. I think the most obvious way is when we experience inequity, whether it's because of our race or our gender or any number of experiences of oppression that many of us have. One of the ways that we focused on personal experiences of institutional bias in the book was through the experience of stereotype threats. So stereotype threats are kind of these unconscious anxieties that are usually can be very personal, can feel very overwhelming. And there is a lot of good research out there that talks about the way that these stereotype threats can actually undermine our own performances. So, for example, if you've ever found yourself, this is a positive example, if you've ever found yourself in a room of friends and you're talking and you're feeling really funny, you might feel like you're really on that night, you're really making people laugh. Researchers are able to somehow demonstrate that you likely are being perceived as being funnier that night. The flip side of all of this is when people have negative perceptions about gender minorities, racial minorities, etc., and we're aware of those negative stereotypes about ourselves, we're more likely to have reduced capacity, the anxiety and the energy that it takes to kind of mitigate and to manage those anxieties can really significantly impact our performance. So that impacts test taking, that impacts job performance, that impacts our health. So really and truly, it doesn't actually matter what the real life people around you think. If you've been exposed to those stereotypes throughout your life, they can have a measurable impact on your performance and on your lifestyle. And the more we talked to people, the more it became clear that this is a real threat to our flourishing. So.
Yeah, and privilege plays into the institutional bias conversation in some very interesting ways, so many different ways. And one of them is this idea that, first of all, I have to preface it by saying that we all have some degree of privilege. So privilege is not something that is, relegated only to a particular demographic or, anything like that. So you can't just say, oh, if you're a white male Christian, you have all of the privilege, and I'm a black woman, I don't have privilege. Doesn't work that way. We all have some. But what privilege does in the context of this conversation is it creates blind spots for us. It creates places where it's much, much more difficult for us to see and understand and experience sometimes the institutional bias that's at play. So the more areas where you are experiencing privilege, the more you have to lose in your mind. It kind of creates a threat response if those biases are addressed in the system. So it is, I like to tell people that, while nobody actually who's sitting here right now created the origin of the biases that we're dealing with, but that doesn't let us off the hook. As a society, as a species, we do have some accountability to each other. So this work really does start with the individual. We have to look at our own stuff. We have to identify our areas of privilege, because where we have those privileges, we might actually be contributing to institutional bias without being aware of it. So I think most of us would consider ourselves decent people, and in doing so, we do have a responsibility to look and see, how am I possibly benefiting from an institutional bias that might exist here? How might I be sort of supporting that? How might I be reinforcing that bias? And those are really hard questions to ask, but those are the kinds of questions that we invite people to grapple with in the context of the book so that they can take action. And the way that we wrote Erasing Institutional Bias is such that you don't have to be the CEO of a company, you don't have to be at the top of an institution or a system in order to affect change. The idea is that anybody can identify where there might be some bias and then do some of the personal work required to gather data, reflect on your own role in the context of that, and affect some change. So we're not powerless is the message there. Hiring and advancement bias, I think, is one that people, for the most part, understand. In the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is the work that I do full time. Oftentimes you will find that folks are looking to create maybe more diverse and inclusive organizations, and they're having trouble sort of identifying diversity. So one of the ways that they realize that they have a challenge, that there might be a hiring bias, is that they are operating within the context of a homogeneous workforce. So whether your organization is all white, all black, or all Asian, it doesn't matter. If you're all one thing, or you have a very largely represented singular population of people, then we'll probably have some things that are out of balance. So we look at what are some of the challenges and some of the things that people can do to identify those biases, and to sort of make new choices around creating more diverse and equitable institutions. And the same thing goes for advancement as well. Sometimes folks do a really good job of recruiting and retention, and they've got United Colors of Benetton across the board, but you notice that you've got all of your diversity kind of concentrated at the bottom of the organization. The higher you go up, the more homogeneous it becomes again. So we help address that.
Race, I think, is a really great example of institutional bias. So most often we think of racism as a one-on-one interaction. So I have a negative feeling about someone of a different race, or I have a negative, I say something negative about someone of a different race, or I do something to someone of a different race because of my feelings. But historically, racial inequity has been propped up not by those individual interactions, but by the way that systems and institutions were built to actually perpetuate racial inequity. So when we really talk about racism, when we really talk about racial inequity, we have to look at institutional bias. We have to look at the way that these institutions and systems were set up. So that's one specific example of institutional bias that kind of illustrates what we're talking about in the book with a number of different biases.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out for race? What would be an example of a racial injustice where institutional bias is working?
That's a great question. So one that is frequently talked about now and is getting a lot more attention, thankfully, is the way that racial inequity is seen in the criminal justice system. And we actually talk about that in the last 2 chapters of the book. For example, people of color and African American men in particular, but also gender nonconforming people as well, of color, are interacting with the criminal justice system at a much, much higher rate, despite not having higher rates of criminal activity than white people. So there's an inequity there. So that actually historically was built into the system through the way that drug laws were written, the way that even laws in the early days of Reconstruction were written to free slaves. So there's a long historical precedent that set us up for where we are today with the criminal justice system. So we can't just say, well, they must be committing more crimes, or they must be, they need to just not do things to get the attention of the police. It's actually something that's historically been put into play that we have to pay more attention to.
And I think that's such an important point about like the way that we approach the book, is that a lot of people are not aware of the historical sort of underpinnings of a lot of these things. So I like to tell people that we've created, particularly in the United States, we've created the America of our own making. This is none of these systems, none of this is an accident. We did this on purpose. And those systems are continuing to perpetuate themselves and have these, these disparate impacts on communities, and historically marginalized communities in particular. And in order for us to do anything about it, we really have to take a long, hard look at how they were built, what those systems are, and begin to unravel them a little bit. So it's really interesting. So one of the things that we spend a good deal of time focusing on in the book is leading with data. We at this point have so much research and so much that we can look into to see what the actual numbers are. It's not about how we feel or what we assume or what we think. There's data that tells us that when people interact with the justice system across racial divides, you can see that there are different people having different experiences based on that variable.
So I'm particularly proud of the way that we addressed gender bias. One of the things that we really wanted to highlight was this idea of benevolent sexism, which is just a term that describes the way that maybe we're not experiencing sexual assault or sexual harassment every single day, but most women are experiencing sexism in terms of these quote-unquote positive stereotypes about women. So that might be like, oh, this office needs a woman's touch, or women are so compassionate and kind and men are just ogres. And so we looked to some studies done by Harvard Business School about the way that these stereotypes actually create environments where sexual assault and harassment are more likely to happen and are more likely to be covered up. And we wanted to name these things so that people who are maybe distancing themselves from the Me Too movement, or saying like, I don't know anybody who's been sexually assaulted, maybe those folks can see that when those more benign seeming things are happening, it's actually not quite as benign as we think it is. So we talked a lot about that. We told some stories of women who have experienced some pretty harrowing things, and gave some ways that these particular women who are really brave in telling their stories have addressed those gender biases.
So one of my favorite things about this book is that we got a lot of stories from a lot of different people about their individual experiences. So rather than write a book that was purely academic or purely theoretical or just based in research, we wanted to hear from people and hear their stories. And we hope that you're able to find yourself in the stories and maybe learn from the solutions that other folks have come up with. And if you do read the book and you enjoy it, please do rate us on Amazon and give us a review. And if you find your story, engage with us on social media. Please like the Erasing Institutional Bias page, and you can find both of us as authors on social media as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.